I actually had Jay lend me his Bible here. I brought a Bible with me, but the print is a little bit small to read in a public setting for somebody of my age. And I expected I would be in a church setting where there would be Bibles, that I could just pick them off of the pews. But I wanted to read from the very beginning, the first chapter of Genesis, actually, Genesis chapter 1, verse, and here's the small print, I think it's 26. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over everything that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." And God said, "Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food, and to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the heavens, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. Now, I'll come back to that in a moment. I wanted to read a short passage from my new book, Citizenship Without Illusions, which came out just, I think it's 2 months ago today, the 26th of November. My first book was called Political Visions and Illusions. It was first published back in 2003. Second edition came out in 2019, and that's the one that Tim Keller endorsed. I'm very grateful to him. I wished I had had the opportunity to thank him personally. Unfortunately, I did not, because over the next few years, in 2020 to 2022, he actually endorsed the book multiple times to various people, and I think that convinced InterVarsity Press to allow me to publish a sequel, which is what this new book is, Citizenship Without Illusions, the illusions in this title being an allusion to the title of the first book. Teaching for 30 years at a Christian university put me in contact with young people from a variety of traditions, some of which have historically taken different stances towards political life. Although I rarely heard it openly articulated, I knew that some had been raised in churches which taught that the believer should leave politics alone, perhaps because it detracted us from the primary task of preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ to a lost world, or possibly because they deemed the political realm unworthy of the follower of Christ. Now, I doubt that I myself ever believed this, at least in part because I grew up in a church community that would not have accommodated such a view. My first 11 years were spent in a fairly conservative Presbyterian congregation near Chicago. The hymnal from which we sang had the Westminster Confession of Faith in the back. Chapter 23 of the Confession is titled "Of the Civil Magistrate," whose second paragraph states, "It is lawful for Christians to accept and execute the office of a magistrate when called thereunto, in the managing whereof, as they ought especially to maintain piety, justice, and peace, according to the wholesome laws of each commonwealth. So for that end they may lawfully, now under the New Testament, wage war upon just and necessary occasions." I don't recall ever hearing a sermon on this part of the confession. And I doubt I read it myself, as I was quite young at the time, but I also never heard anyone express opposition to Christians assuming political office. The church's official stance would have precluded this. However, by the time I reached my youth, our family was attending a different kind of church, and there was more diversity of viewpoints on the relationship between the Christian and the civil commonwealth. I took a temporary turn towards pacifism around this time, but while I continue to appreciate those Christian traditions that favor nonviolence, I began to conclude that rejecting the state's power of the sword out of hand could not be reconciled, for example, with the Apostle Paul's statements in the letter to the Romans. This is quoting from Romans 13. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, he who resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of him who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. He is the servant of God to execute his wrath on the wrongdoer. Now, I was especially impressed by Paul calling the political ruler God's servant. A servant of God might still exercise the power of the sword, not for his own purposes, but for doing public justice within the context of a larger political order. Now, of course, we recognize that Paul wrote his letter to the Romans under an autocratic imperial political system that had developed out of republican institutions a few generations earlier. Citizenship did not belong to everybody in the empire, but only to certain residents of the city of Rome and to those in the periphery, recognized to have a special relationship to the imperial center. Although he was a Jew from Tarsus in Asia Minor, Paul was born a citizen of Rome, a status he was ready to invoke if the need arose. For example, in Acts 22 to 29. Nevertheless, even possessing Roman citizenship did not make him an active participant in the business of governing the empire, because that was monopolized, as we all know, by the emperor himself. Rome was by no means a democratic polity, even if we owe to it many of our political and legal principles. Reading and analyzing Romans 13, as well as 1 Peter 2, where Peter says, "Fear God and honor the emperor," persuaded me that the exercise of political office is not beyond the scope of the Christian's active obedience to God. Of course, not many of us will hold such familiar offices as mayor, city councilor, governor, premier, parliamentarian, president, prime minister, or monarch. But every one of us is a citizen, and citizenship is no less significant a political office for frequently escaping our notice. How we conduct ourselves as citizens of our respective political communities definitely comes under the sovereignty of God over the whole of our lives. Although many Christians have distinguished between sacred and secular realms, usually relegating politics and much else to the latter, a biblical worldview is a holistic one, recognizing that God calls us to live our whole lives in obedience to his expressed will in gratitude for our salvation in Jesus Christ. I came to understand this truth more fully during my undergraduate studies half a century ago, and it changed my life. Now, as a boy, I had a variety of interests that I could have followed. Very early, I developed an interest in the visual arts. I was drawing incessantly when I was a young boy in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, and I believe I had actual talents in that, which I developed more when I was in high school. Not much since that time, as other things occupied my interest. I came from a musical family. In the Christmas Eve, we would go around to our neighbors, and we would sing in makeshift harmony to our neighbors, and they seemed to enjoy that. As a matter of fact, my last year in high school, the 1972-1973, as I was thinking about going to university and thinking about applying to universities, I was thinking that I would major in either art or music, because those were my two passions at the time. I had a lot of other interests as well, foreign languages. My father was born in the island of Cyprus, grew up speaking Greek and Turkish in addition to also English and French, and I think he learned Arabic as well. He was actually in Palestine as a correspondent for a consortium of British newspapers in 1948 during the First Middle Eastern War. He had a near brush with death, decided that that was too dangerous a place for him to be at the tender age of 20 years old, decided to go to Africa and worked for a Greek entrepreneur in Nigeria. And it was there he met American missionaries. He attended a school in Cyprus that was run by Reformed Presbyterians, the same people who run Geneva College in Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania. And he discovered a living relationship with Jesus Christ at that school and also in contact with the missionaries in Nigeria. He decided to come to the United States and study at a Bible college in Chicago. And that's where he met my mother. My mother was from Michigan, an American, and they decided to get married. And then about 9 months and 2 weeks later, I was born. So they started pretty quickly, and then I have 5 younger siblings as well. Growing up during the 1960s, very turbulent time, as many of you may know from your ancient history. A very turbulent time in the United States at that time. You think that you're going through troubles right now. In the 1960s, my first political memory was of the Kennedy-Nixon presidential campaign in 1960. My parents favored Nixon at the time. Nixon actually came vice president at the time under President Eisenhower to speak at the small Christian university in my hometown, west of Chicago. And I still have a dim memory of seeing him, darker hair at the time, standing up there and addressing the crowds. And as a 5-year-old, I had no idea what he was talking about. My next major political memory was of the assassination of John Kennedy on the 22nd of November, Friday. I was in grade 3, 1963. And I can remember watching WGN during the lunch hour on WGN television. Bozo the Clown was on the air, as he always was during the lunch times when the children were home. Having somebody, an announcer, break in, and I can still remember the exact words. "We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. President Kennedy has been shot and wounded in Dallas." After 61 years, those words are etched in my mind. 5 years later, we were going to a church potluck supper. This is when we were attending a Baptist church, and they were going to be raising funds to add to the building. It was either on the way there or on the way back that we heard on the car radio, this was the 4th of April, 1968, that Dr. Martin Luther King had been assassinated. Just utter shock. And then June, just months later, after he had won the California primary, Bobby Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, was shot. And as I was 13 at the time, and just beginning to approach adolescence, this was a terrifying time. The United States was bogged down in an unwinnable war in Vietnam. And as I neared the age of 18, I was very much aware that I could be conscripted into the military and sent overseas to Vietnam. Now, as a matter of fact, I have very bad eyes. In retrospect, I don't think they would have taken me. I've worn glasses for the last 60-some years, and I'm extremely nearsighted. I think I would be able to see colors and so forth and shapes here, but that's all I'd be able to see without the glasses. So that's the kind of period that I grew up in at the time. When I started university, I started out as a music major. I took a full year of music theory. I was singing with the choir at that university in Minnesota. And during that crucial year, there were 2 events that moved me towards the study of politics and to thinking in a more focused way about what does it mean to be a citizen. Those were the Watergate scandal, which was really gathering force at the time that I started university. Although I was a music major, and that's still a passion of mine, music, still a passion of mine, I was following the Senate Watergate hearing on television, and I was seeing the scandal unfold. And although my parents had supported Nixon in 2 elections, I began to have doubts that such a person ought to be running the country. And so at that point, of course, during the summer, then everything blew up. Nixon ended up resigning in August of 1974. At the same time, a crisis was brewing in my father's native island of Cyprus. And in July of 1974, between my first and second year at university, as I was actually working for my father during that summer, filling orders for his company and so forth, and at that point there was an overthrow of the government of President Makarios, who was also Archbishop of the Church of Cyprus. This is having a political leaders and religious leaders goes back to the Ottoman Turkish era, and what ended up happening was the island ended up being divided. Turkey landed its military forces in Kyrenia on the north coast of Cyprus, established a beachhead all the way down to Nicosia, the capital, and divided the city. Shortly after Nixon resigned, and while Gerald Ford was still getting used to the office, Turkey took advantage of the reality that the Americans were not paying sufficient attention to what they were doing, expanded their hold to 37% of the island in the north. And that's when all of my paternal relatives, including my elderly grandparents, who were born in the last 2 decades of the 19th century, became refugees in their own country. For 2 weeks, we did not know what happened to our relatives overseas, until finally, on a telex machine, and a telex is kind of in between the telegraph and email. And I was operating my dad's telex machine when I was working in the office. Finally, my dad's eldest brother sends a message to us, and it was one of these click, 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 it all comes out. And it said, "All well." And we breathed a huge sigh of relief. Here I was, a suburban kid, growing up in one of the suburbs of Chicago, one of the more prosperous suburbs of Chicago at that, being insulated, fairly sheltered from events that were going on around the world. But when I was 19 years old, then all of my father's family lost their homes and had to move to the south part of the island, where they had to start new lives all over again. And if you could imagine New York City being divided down the middle, a wall being built, couldn't go to one part of the city. This is what the residents of Berlin had to endure for 28 years between 1961 and 1989. That told me immediately that even if up to that point politics was a secondary or maybe a tertiary interest of mine, politics nevertheless had an interest in me, because events that were taking place around the world were affecting people that I loved. And in the half century since those events, I've seen other events happen, the extraordinary events, the fall of the Berlin Wall, when I was in my third year of teaching. Up until that time, I couldn't even imagine. Every day I was coming into the classroom and saying, something else has happened. The government in Czechoslovakia, remember that country, doesn't exist anymore, fell. And then the Berlin Wall opens. A semi-free election in Poland in June of 1989. And all of these extraordinary events that were happening at that time. And then the collapse of the Soviet Union at the very time that I started teaching a course on Soviet government. And the assignment that I gave to my students was completely irrelevant by the time that course ended. So, and then, of course, come into this century, 9/11, which affected all of us here in New York. And events happen, that change our lives. And they bring bring home to us the fact that we are citizens of the earthly kingdoms. Augustine wrote his famous De Civitate Dei, the city of God, after Alaric and his Goths sacked Rome in AD 410. People were stunned. How could this happen? Rome is the center of the world. It wasn't the capital by that time, that was Constantinople. But nevertheless, Rome, the eternal city, how could it possibly be sacked by barbarians? And many people at that time were blaming Christians. It's because we have abandoned the old gods, and they are wreaking their vengeance on us. Augustine wrote The City of God, and it wasn't just a short tract like my Citizenship Without Illusions. This is a massive tome if you've ever read it, massive tome talking about the history of the kingdom of God, the city of God, in parallel with the city of this world. And to show that kingdoms will come and go. And that's something that we already read in the book of Daniel. The earthly kingdoms, they come and go. But God will establish a kingdom that lasts forever. Daniel looks forward to the coming of Christ. And we now look back to the first coming of Christ and recognize that we are in between the times. We are citizens of God's kingdom. We are citizens of our various earthly kingdoms, whether it's Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, whatever country. Our ultimate allegiance is to the city of God. And we have this eschatological hope. Eschatology is a fancy word for the things that revolve around the end times. And we recognize that we are heading towards the final consummation of God's kingdom at the end. And that is the source of hope that we have for our lives, even our political lives, in the here and now. And I'll stop here, and I believe there's time for questions.